So far in this course, we have been discussing musical materials without using musical notation. We have referred to pitches by name, such as C sharp, G, and so on, and we learned how to find those pitches on a piano keyboard. We also started talking about intervals, that is, the musical distance between pitches, as well as harmony using functional terminology such as tonic, predominant, and dominant. But now it's time to get more technical. We're going to need to be able to notate the melodies and chords we talk about. In the last lecture I talked about the octave being subdivided by 12 notes, which sound like this. This series of 12 half steps is called a chromatic scale. We have already seen how the piano keyboard clearly shows its almost 8 octaves with white keys separated by a repeating pattern of 2 and 3 black keys. Each octave contains 12 notes consisting of 7 white keys and 5 black keys on the keyboard. The interval between each white key and its neighboring black key, or between 2 white keys without a black key, is a half step, which sounds like this. We could refer to these 12 notes by number, either 1 through 12, or more common in the theory world, 0 through 11. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 0. Starts over again. But mostly we use letter names with sharps and flats to label the 12 pitches. We call sharps and flats accidentals. Let's start with the C from the last lecture. This one, which has a frequency of 262 Hertz. Because it's the note that falls near the middle of the 88-key piano keyboard, we call it middle C. It's commonly called C4 because it is the 4th C on the piano keyboard. All the notes above a C share the same octave number. So this is F2 because it lies between C2 and C3. This is B flat 6, also known as A sharp 6. Over the last 1,000 years or so, a system of musical notation evolved into what we use today. It roughly corresponds to the piano keyboard. A notated musical composition is called a score. In the jazz world, notated arrangements are typically called charts. Musical notation uses 5-line or 4-space staves, the singular is staff, on which each line and space corresponds to a letter name, A through G. But we don't know which notes are which on this generic staff until we add a clef. This squiggly thing is called a treble clef. In musical terms, treble means high. It specifies which lines and spaces correspond to which notes, and it tells us what octaves we are in. First, the lines and spaces. In a treble staff, that is a staff that has a treble clef, the top line is F, specifically this F, or F5. The space below this is E, the line below that is D, and so on, down to the bottom line, which is E4. Notice that we can use the spaces immediately above and below the staff as well. The low D is shown here. The space immediately above the F line on top would be a G. There are all sorts of ways to remember what letter goes with each line and space. Every good boy does fine for the lines, for example. But it's better to just practice using the staves enough that you can just read the notes. Notice that the curlicue on the treble clef loops around the G line. Thus this clef is sometimes called a G clef. This staff corresponds roughly to the range of women's voices in classical vocal music. They can go lower and higher, but most notes can be written on this staff. Lower voices in instruments use a staff that has a bass clef. The top line of the bass staff is A3, the A immediately below middle C on the piano. Notice that the two dots on the bass clef are on either side of the F line. This clef is sometimes called an F clef, since it seems to be pointing to F. The other common clef, which we won't be dealing with in this course, looks like this. The gap in the squiggles always points to middle C. In this case, called an alto clef, middle C is the middle line on the staff, but this clef could point to any line on the staff as middle C. Let's put some notes on the treble staff using quarter notes and a half note. First, the notes shown here, left to right, are E quarter note, D quarter note, and C half note. Notice that the last two notes are off the staff. The D is written immediately below the staff on a space that has no lower staff line as a boundary. The last note, the C, requires its own temporary staff line called a ledger line. Notice that we don't need a ledger line below the C. With ledger lines, we can go as high and as low as we want. Here, the notes on the bass staff are exactly the same as those on the treble staff. The two staves, bass and treble, overlap on middle C, which is one ledger line above the bass staff and one ledger line below the treble staff, like this. These two dotted half notes are both on middle C, that is C4, 262 Hertz. For instruments or voices that can only play or sing a single note at a time, we only use a single staff. Low instruments or voices use the bass staff, and high instruments or voices use the treble staff. In both cases, to avoid ledger lines. The one exception is the piano, and other keyboard instruments, which can play many notes at once. Because a pianist has two hands, it makes sense to use two staves, one for each hand. Here we see a treble staff and a bass staff combined with a bracket into a grand staff. The lower staff is played by the left hand, and the upper staff is played by the right hand. Notice that at one point we have both hands playing the same note, middle C. Composers usually prefer to keep the hands separate this way, rather than combine the notes into a single note head. That's enough for now. In this lecture, you learned about the chromatic scale, where middle C is on the piano, and where it and other notes fall on the 5-line staff, using a treble clef, a bass clef, ledger lines, and the grand staff. In future lectures, we'll dig into the details of rhythmic notation so that we can actually write a tune on a staff.